This exchange between Areva Martin and David Webb almost made me cry laughing at it. So I want you guys to listen to what I heard, and I'm going to do a little reaction to it, all right? So beware. Viewers' discretion is advised.
I've chosen to cross different parts of the media world, done the work so that I'm qualified to be in each one. I never considered my color the issue. I considered my qualifications the issue.
Well,
So I just want y'all to hear that. He just pointed out that color has never been a factor in his pursuit of success. He's always saw that his profession or what he's done, what his accomplishment, what he has been able to accomplish has been the leading factor in his progress. Now listen to what the social justice warrior says.
David, you know, that's a whole nother long conversation about white privilege and things that you have the privilege of doing that people of color don't have the privilege of.
She just called him white, man. She just said that he has white privilege, that this brother got white privilege. Let's finish listening to this.
How do I have the privilege of white privilege?
David, by virtue of being a white male, you have white privilege. This whole long conversation, I don't have time to get
Areva.
Hold on. She said by virtue of you being a white man, you have white privilege. And he's black, though. He's a black man. Watch him eat her alive real quick. Go ahead, play it.
I hate to break it to you, but you should have been better prepped. I'm black.
Okay, then
black.
I stand.
See, you went to white privilege. This is the falsehood in this. You went immediately with an assumption. Your people, obviously, or you didn't look. You're talking to a black man who started out in rock radio in Boston, who crossed the paths into hip-hop, rebuilding one of the greatest black stations in America, and went on to work for Fox News, where I'm told apparently blacks aren't supposed to work, but yet you come with this assumption and you go to white privilege.
David,
that's actually insulting.
It is, and I apologize because my people gave me wrong information. They told
No. You can't, no. Your people gave you wrong information. No. It doesn't work that way. The false assumption of white privilege is being perpetuated so often that without even knowing the race of the man, because of his accomplishments, he's automatically deemed as a white man with privilege. So this is the part that kills me. This is the idea of reverse racism. This is black people projecting racism on white people unchecked, unfettered. Listen to this. She is literally saying, and this is not only projecting hatred against white people.
When they didn't have the power of the sun, that the sun then started to deteriorate them. So then they're acting out of fear. They're acting out of low self-esteem. They're acting out of a deficiency. So therefore, the only way that they can act is evil. The only way they have to rob, steal, rape, kill, and
fight or flight, okay,
in order to survive.
Exactly.
So then these people who didn't have what we had, and when I say we, I speak of the melanated people.
Right.
They had to be savages. They had to be barbaric. Because they're in these Nordic mountains, they're in these rough torrential environments, so they're acting as animals.
Right.
So they're the ones that are actually closer to animals. They're the ones that are actually the true savages.
Listen, at the end of the day, the color of your skin don't matter. The content of your character matter. How hard you're going to work, that's what matters. And we're all Americans at the end of the day, and if you bust your tail in this country, you can be successful. The end.
But you wouldn't not acknowledge that there are some systemic issues.
Give me an example. Tell me what you think the most systemic racist issue is. What is it?
Well, I would say that because black people in many cases, were descendants of slaves, that racism as an institution, that it just, a certain amount of it just exists.
2015? Give me the most blatant racist example you can come up with right now.
I think you could probably find evidence that, in general, cops are more willing to shoot if the perpetrator is black
What's your data
than white.
What's your basis for saying that? Last year...
Well, look, I know a lot of people would say, look what's going on in Chicago.
I know what they would say.
Yeah.
I'm talking about what the facts are. 965 people were shot by cops last year and killed. 4% of them were white cops shooting unarmed blacks. In Chicago in 2011, 21 people were shot and killed by cops. In 2015, there were 7. In Chicago, which is a third black, a third white, and a third Hispanic, 70% of the homicides are black on black. About 40 per month, almost 500 per year last year in Chicago, and 75% of them are unsolved. Where is the Black Lives Matter on that? The idea that a racist white cop shooting unarmed black people is a peril to black people is BS. It's complete and total BS. And the reason for these so-called activists saying this is the assumption that racism remains a major problem in America. The media, CNN, especially MSNBC, runs down whenever a black cop shoots somebody, and it's some march on Washington. It's ridiculous. Black people, half the homicides in this country are committed by and against black people. Last year there were 14,000 homicides. Not talking about suicides, I'm talking about homicides. Half of them were black, 96% of them black on black of that 7,000. Where's the Black Lives Matter people on that?
So there's where you would say that this is purely because of social justice. This is purely because they want ultimately for people to be angry enough to just keep voting Democrat.
That's right. And where's the evidence of a lack of social justice? When a black suspect is killed by a cop, believe me, the media is on it. People are watching it, and justice will, for the most part, occur. In Baltimore, where Freddie Gray was killed, Freddie Gray died in a van. I shouldn't say was killed. Died in a van. Yeah. You have a city that's 45% black. City council is 100% Democrat. The majority of city council is black. The top cop at the time was black. The number 2 cop was black. The majority of the command staff is black. The mayor is black. The AG is black. And yet here we are talking about racism. I mean, it's absurd. Yeah. It's absurd.
So it's funny, I find myself caught in between this a little bit as a liberal where I want to always try to defend the other. So in this case, the other being black people, I'm always sympathetic to that. And that, at the same time, I hear you laying out a pretty solid case.
These are just the facts. I'll tell you something else, too. There was just a study, University of Washington, and it turns out cops were more reluctant, more hesitant to pull the trigger against a black suspect than a white suspect, probably because of the fear of being accused of racially profiling and the fear that the civil rights establishment was going to come down on them. So if anything, whites are more likely to be shot by a cop under certain circumstances than a black person. And in the last 30 or 40 years, the percentage of suspects killed by cops who are black has declined 75%. However, the percentage of whites killed by cops has flatlined.
Yeah.
And so if anything, people are more concerned about shooting black people for fear that they're going to be called racist. And almost every one of these incidents, whether it's Eric Gardner in New York, who died because he was selling Lucy's and resisted arrest, whether it's Tamir Rice in Cleveland, who was twirling around the gun, whether it's Michael Brown in Ferguson, who had just committed a strong-arm robbery, almost every one of these incidents involved somebody resisting arrest. Why don't you just do what the police tell you? My dad said, when I get pulled over, have my hand at 10 o'clock, have my hand at 2 o'clock, say yes, sir, say no, sir, make sure my paperwork is in order, and if I feel the cop is mistreating me, get a badge number and deal with it later on. If Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and Obama and the whole group of them told black people to do that, we'd have a lot fewer of these things to deal with in the first place.
Yeah. All right, so I'm with you. I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying here. So as a black conservative then, who now you've laid out your case there.
But you haven't laid out yours. I asked you to name the most important example of racism, and you gave white cops going after black people. And I told you, gave you the facts for that, so that's nonsense. So you must have something else. What else is it? If you think racism remains a problem in America, give it to me.
Well, I think it remains a problem.
Give it to me.
It may not be systemic in that it's not like you're not being hired because you're black. There's no systemic reason, legal reason that exists, that kind of thing. But I think that racism as a general theory exists.
I need some specifics. You gave me the white cop thing. What else? Give me another example where you think is a problem.
Well, as a black conservative, tell me how do you get people to come around?
You're the one who made the assertion that you think racism remains a major problem in America. I asked you to give me an example. You gave me white cops going after blacks. As far as I'm concerned, you didn't hold it up very well. What's the other argument you have? What's the other thing?
Well, I don't know that it's systemic in the sort of macro sense.
I'm not mad. I just want to know what it is you're talking about.
That's exactly what. Believe me, that's 100% why I wanted to have you.
Blacks are not getting into school. BS. We have we have affirmative action. So a black person with an SAT and a GPA of X will get into a school faster and easier than a white person with an SAT or a GPA of X. And if going to school is a route to the middle class, you can make an argument that blacks have an easier route to the middle class. If you're talking about about poverty, the poorer you are, the more accessible loans and grants are for you. The problem, the biggest burden that black people have, in my opinion, again, is the percentage of blacks, 75% of them, that are raised without fathers. And that has every other social negative consequence connected to it. Crime, not being able to compete economically in the country, being more likely to be arrested, that's the #1 problem facing the black community. And when I hear people tell me about systemic racism or unconscious racism, I always say, give me an example, and almost nobody can do it.
So the family stuff. So I'll follow your logic there on the family stuff. What can actually be done about that then? I mean, because that's a big
reverse the welfare state. In 1890, 1900, you look at census reports. A black kid, believe it or not, was slightly more likely to be born to a nuclear intact family than a white kid. Even during slavery, a black kid was more likely to be born under a roof with his biological mother and biological father than today. What's happened is we launched this so-called war on poverty in the 60s, where literally Lyndon Johnson sent people knocking on doors. I lived in the 60s, and people knocked on doors apprising women of their availability to welfare, provided there was no man in the house. And we went from 25% of blacks being born outside of wedlock in 65 to 75% right now. And you look at how much money that we spent on welfare, and the lines are parallel. It was a neutron bomb dropped on this country, not just on the black community, but on people in general. At one time, only about 5% of whites were born outside of wedlock. Now 25% of whites are born outside of wedlock. I was in college in 1970, and there was a report called the Moynihan Report, The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. It's written by a liberal, by a man who became a Democratic senator from New York. And at the time, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. He said, my God, this number is horrific. If we don't do something about it, it could get even higher. Well, fast forward, 25% of white kids are now born outside of wedlock. It is the #1 problem in this country, and what we've done, in my opinion, is we've economically incentivized women to marry the government, and we've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. And now we have this.
Well, let me do a strange thing. Let me steel man perhaps the most outrageous point that Robin Diangelo makes in her book, the one that we are all being being exposed to too much. And this is that all white people are racist. We've all heard this now, and I don't know for sure that it originates with her, but her book is currently the one that is spreading most widely, and we've talked about it before on this show. So the point is absurd on its face, for sure. All white people are racist, really. But the trick here is that she has redefined what racist means. And so that's illegitimate. And I think we've mentioned before that Merriam-Webster's the dictionary is now falling in line with this redefinition of racism. And, that's a kind of doublespeak. That's, the second form of new language that Orwell writes about, not newspeak, but doublespeak, turning extant terms into something that means something so different that when people use them, no one is quite sure which meaning they intend to be using. So if we sidestep that linguistic trap, though, that she's laid for us, and say, well, certainly I know I'm not racist. What the hell is she talking about? What she means, and I really don't know that she has anything good faith about her at all. But what she and the movement means when they are talking truth is that it's true that people with white skin do continue to benefit from the privileges, especially historic, but also still contemporary, that having white skin confers. That has been true. And that's true even though class and geography are often better predictors of outcomes than is skin color. So We can all imagine, say, a poor white girl in Alabama, in rural Alabama, versus a middle-class black girl in Chicago, and ask, who is more likely to succeed in this world? And it's going to be the black child in this case, even though it is also true that when those two people are making decisions about where to drive, at what time of night, and what stores to go into, and what their reaction is if they're driving and they see police, is going to be different by race. So all of those things can be true. And, it's insane, objectionable, reprehensible, all of this, to call that thing racism. That is actually deplorable, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to take that word back too. But it does obscure, bizarrely, right? It obscures this kernel of truth at the bottom. And now you have people pushing back so hard against this insane nonsense that they are also pushing back against the thing that is true. And that is going to be where the divide actually sticks, I think.
They are going to call forth exactly the racist beast that they are claiming dominates the landscape right now, by forcing white people, by backing them into the wall together. You're going to force them to see things in racial terms. And it's not a surprise what's coming. It's perfectly predictable, and it's extremely dangerous.
Yep.
So anyway, good job, Steel Manning. Obviously, the problem with the analysis is that we are forced to the last step. It's not that things are racially well distributed. It's not that they have ever gotten to zero, right? We never neutralized the effects of slavery and Jim Crow. And so we don't even know what the experiment would do. I have a pretty good guess, but we don't know what the experiment would do if you ever got everybody to the starting line at the same time. And I think it would be quite equal. But what we are told is that the very fact of disadvantage that shows up in outcomes is evidence of racism, which is a cognitive process occurring inside of the minds of white people. We are also told not only is it there and in need of immediate challenge, but it is incurable.
Yeah.
Okay, those two things don't go together.
Yeah. No, there's a bait and switch constantly. And, we can look at this book, this insane White Fragility book, and it's harder to pinpoint the claims of activists because they'll always say, I didn't mean it then. It was, it's not what it seems. But the talking about the population level, the actual systemic truth of systems that have benefited people with white skin, conflating that with individual level racism is something that the movement claims to understand the distinction between, but is very, very happy to do a constant bait and switch between. And of course, this final point that you make, the idea that not only are you born racist, but if you claim you're not, you're proving that you're racist. And if you claim you are, well, then you're obviously racist. It's I think the central rhetorical trap of a rhetorical Kafka trap of the entire book and the entire movement, that any defense of yourself is taken as evidence that you are in fact guilty of the thing of which you are accused.
Yeah, there's no escape. And therefore, what is the conclusion of that? The conclusion is you have to do what we say.
Right.
Anybody who understood that you are guilty of racism inherently because of the color of your skin, and who doesn't like that because who likes racism, anybody who agrees with those things, the next question is, okay, well, then you're an ally, aren't you? Oh, yeah, I guess I'm an ally. Oh, well, then if you're an ally, what does that mean? It means you have to do what we say, which means you have to take the risk on our behalf, which means you have to go and punish other people. And so it is a contagious ideology.
Oh, it's effective. And we see many of the usual suspects on campus speaking their willfully ridiculous truths.
Yeah.
And we see her actively dividing people. And in her language, some of the stuff that's not even in the book, which wasn't out yet, like the book came out in 2018, but she was already doing her damage all over the place. We see, I hear in what she says, even some of the turns of phrase that we then saw from our own colleagues just months later that then took an entire college down.
Right. So
she's incredibly powerful.
This is my point.
Yeah.
That was a talk.
Yeah.
Now, had I been at Evergreen when she was there, I would have gone to that talk and I would have asked pointed questions. But it's obviously lethal to people who don't have the proper tools to figure out how to escape the logical traps, right? Yeah. I'm just saying, if you're not expecting these traps, they'll catch you off guard and you'll sign up for things that seem safe and they won't be.
People, really a coalition of the unhappy, is tearing down statues, desecrating monuments, but that destruction is more than simply symbolic. It's a deliberate effort to erase history, to separate us from our past and its useful lessons, and distract from the problems that are affecting Americans today. In Chicago, for example, where more than 50 people have been shot with guns this week, politicians are now moving to erase American history altogether. State Representative LaShawn Ford is calling on the Illinois State Board of Education to abolish all history classes in all schools statewide, claiming that teaching American history leads to racism. Jason Hill is the author of the book We Have Overcome. He's a professor at DePaul University in Chicago, and we're happy to have him on tonight. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. So, eliminating all history. Explain, if you will, what you think the idea is behind this.
Well, thank you for having me again, Tucker. I think what we're seeing in the educational system is systemic nihilism. So let's go back a step further. A couple weeks ago, Rutgers University declared that grammar was racist. Now, grammar is a science that deals with the proper method of oral and written communication. When you attack grammar, you attack language, which is the method of cognition. So you attack man's mind. You attack his ability to reason. Yes. So you attack man's mind, which means you leave us on the level of grunting farm animals. So you leave us incapacitated to reason, to think, and then you take away his history. You take away human history. You take away our constitutional rights, or Bill of Rights, or Second Amendment, or First Amendment, or time-worn principles that we use to defend our way of life, or Judeo-Christianity. You're looking at systemic nihilism. You're looking at the Antichrist, as far as I'm concerned. You're looking at a bunch of nihilists and anarchists that want to destroy a system and replace it with nothing. Nothing at all. They want to destroy the good for the sake of it being the good. I have been warning, I have talked about this on your show, that these postmodern nihilists that started from back in the 60s, when we had these fake disciplines attacking reason, valorizing feelings as the only criteria for adjudicating disputes, one's feelings and one feeling of being offended as the only criterion for adjudicating disputes, and dispensing with reason, objective reality, and logic as the construct of imperialist, racist white men. That's what we're seeing today. And so you dispense with history altogether.
I'm transfixed by what you just said. I hope that this finds its way on the internet and is viewed by many, Professor, because I think you just put it as crisply as I've ever heard it. What's happening? And it's as scary as you say it is.
During her first run for Congress last year, Ocasio-Cortez suggested that the incumbent who held the seat didn't deserve to be in Congress because he was the wrong race. By Election Day, her opponent was literally apologizing for his own skin color. When he accused Ocasio-Cortez of making the election about race, she didn't run from it. Quote, "It is about race," end quote. Not so long ago, a campaign like that would have been considered deeply immoral. The press would have hounded Ocasio-Cortez until she apologized or dropped out, but not anymore. A ruling class no longer recognizes universal standards of any kind. Racism, they've decided, cuts only one way. So they ignored Ocasio-Cortez's race baiting, and she got elected. Over time, like any untreated virus, her bigotry grew more inflamed. Here was Ocasio-Cortez just last week in a public hearing explaining that actually global climate change is the fault of a specific racial group. Watch.
Do we see largely that it's the global South and communities of color that may be bearing the brunt of the initial havoc from climate change?
Without a doubt, without a doubt.
And in terms of that wealth, the people who are producing climate change, the folks that are responsible for the largest amount of emissions, or communities or corporations, they tend to be predominantly white, correct?
Yes, and every study backs that up.
The people that are producing climate change, end quote. That's right. Those people, the ones destroying the earth, driving entire species to extinction, killing children. Ever notice how all those people look alike? They've got something in common, don't they? That's right. They're the same color. That's what she's saying. And here's the amazing part. Nobody seemed to even notice when Ocasio-Cortez said that in the middle of a congressional hearing. Rulers acted like it was all totally normal, because increasingly for them, it is normal.
I was your classic white liberal. I was late to college. I grew up poor, and I didn't go to college till much later in life. And I graduated with a degree in sociology and had no idea what I could do for a living. And I applied for a job as a diversity trainer. And I thought two things that'll show how naive I was. One, that sounds so fun. And two, of course I'm qualified. You know, I'm a vegetarian. How could I be racist?
And it's the corrupt nature that makes you want to sin. So with privilege, you have the corrupt nature to want to maintain your own, in this case, identity-based, so racial or sexual superiority. And so you have, a lot of concepts that run in parallel that way. You have, kind of this vague concept of social justice that acts as kind of the God figure, and then you have it split into tripartite diversity, equity, and inclusion that actually spells out DEI, Dei, which is Latin for God. Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's weird. That's a bit weird, how people look at what's going on now and don't see parallels to witch hunts is hard to say. On Rogan, I went on Rogan last week, and maybe you guys caught that. I don't know. But I talked about how there are kind of like up religions and down religions in a sense. And like an up religion is looking up to God and is aware of sin and is trying to, do right. But their focus is on that harmony, that healing, that redemption, that grace, that forgiveness that comes with looking up to, the perfect Almighty Creator, trying to live up to that image. Down religions, though, are obsessively looking at like the profane, the sin, the dirt,
they lift them
the
up.
demons. It's sort of like that, isn't it? Yeah, sort of like that. And so this is, you mentioned the word cult. It's very like idolatrous, where now this worldly thing. I know I love getting to talk to Christians and getting a little theological with this. Flex my atheism cred. But no, it's like this worldly thing. Race, identity, and so on becomes an idol. And like you said, there are very cult-like dynamics. So some of my emails that I've had are from these Jehovah's Witnesses are like, I know this, I know what's happening here. The separating you from your group, breaking you down emotionally to try to fill you in, to get you to feel vulnerability, guilt, and shame, and so on, and fill in the resolution of that with the doctrine. There's always like this temptation to cults that are manipulating vulnerability and especially guilt and shame, and then trying to stuff a doctrine on top of it. Calvinism says that humans are fallen, but it also speaks mostly of grace. And Calvinism is one of the harder core Christian denominations looking at this, right? So it does admit humans' fallen nature, but it also speaks of grace, at least irresistible grace for the elect, if nothing else. And then using that as a model, since it's not known who is and who is not elect to any but God. So therefore, it is a model for everybody to try to aspire to in order to try to, hopefully be led in that direction. So there's a difference between, a religion and some poisonous cult thing. And this thing, like, I get people are like, I'm an ex-Scientologist, alarm bells going off. And then they're like, I was in this weird backwards Christian cult, some lunatic that had his whole thing, and alarm bells going off. I was Jehovah's Witness, alarm bells going off. I was in communist Romania. I talked to a guy the other day, a Romanian guy, and he was like, this is bad. So this is this is a thing that's setting off the alarm bells of people who have escaped cults or escaped communist, which is cult, circumstances. And so, it's a bad place. And, people are getting shamed, and these weird things we described already in these meetings and what follows after them. It's just really a bad thing.
So Robin Diangelo would be the Joel Osteen of wokeism.
She might be.
And then
she's cashing in. The difference is I don't know if Joel Osteen believes it. I don't know, but I think Robin Diangelo does believe it.
You think
I think
she's
that
sincere?
in fact, in fact, I don't. It's past sincere. I know you're not allowed. I'm not a psychologist, so I can do what I want. You're not allowed to diagnose people from a distance, but there's actually, I don't know if you guys know this, there's actually a religious form of OCD that's called scrupulosity. It's very common in Catholics. It's not too. Yeah, it does. It sounds like something like.
Hey, bro.
Download the app.
Yeah, play Scrupulosity with me.
That's Robin Diangelo's the whole thing. You could make like a Monopoly board, put her head in scrupulosity. But no, the deal is that it's religious OCD, where basically you feel like you haven't resolved your own complicity in sin correctly, and therefore you're bound for the hellfire. Right. And it's actually super common in Catholics. It's somewhat common in Mormons, and you sometimes see it in the stricter variants of Calvinism. And I don't know, it probably shows up in Islam as well. I actually just don't know on that. But it is a form of OCD where you're trying to like out damn spot Lady Macbeth yourself for your complicity in sin. And I think that Diangelo, whose mother was a lapsed nun, who went on to become a leftist social activist. I do think that Diangelo, it's not even her real last name, exhibits a rather strong case of scrupulosity. And to read White Fragility is basically a 157 or 8-page confession of that, and then projection of it onto all white people.
It seems like another way that wokeism tends to be like a cult is this control of language. You know, like I'll read,
ever-changing.
I'll click on some thread of progressives that are debating, you know, am I racist? Are you racist? And the words they use, the terms that are, you know, redefined or invented terms, it's bizarre.
Oh yeah. That's why I'm writing the encyclopedia on, I got to do my like little shtick, you know, like, hi, James Lindsay, newdiscourses.com. Then I've got an encyclopedia there, translations from the Wokish, Social Justice Encyclopedia, newdiscourses.com. That's my commercial. But no, you can go on there, and I have since Christmas. I started at Christmas. I started writing a social justice encyclopedia because of this problem with the terminology. And so many terms, there are specialized terms and all of this other stuff, you know, that are just academic terms, but so many terms we're all familiar with everyday language: racist, anti-racist, fascist, anti-fascist, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, social justice, critical. All of these terms have like very specialized different meanings. So, you know, they say, well, we need to engage critically with this, you know. So somebody publishes something and they say, well, we need to engage critically with this. And everybody that's kind of grown up learning critical thinking in schools is like, yeah, critical thinking, that's very good. We need to do that. But what they mean when they say we need to engage critical with this is something different. What they actually mean is we need to find all the problematics in it and turn it into a woke thing. We need to burn out all the wokeness. When they say we need diversity, what they mean is we need diversity of authentic voices, which here we still sound good. But what they define as an authentic voice is somebody that is authentically representing their oppressed, systemically oppressed identity as described by the critical social justice theory and ideology. So what they mean is people who have different identity markers, but who can speak the way that they say that you have to speak about having those identity markers. So diversity means lots of critical theorists of different colors and a minimal number of them who happen to be white allies who they rather intensely excoriate. So, I mean, the whole thing is this giant rabbit hole of twisty-turvy language. And then, like you guys said, with the cult thing, right? So often the mechanism that drags people into cults, it's not how you really do like cult control, but it's that manipulation of vulnerability. So one of the maneuvers is you say, oh, well, I'm not racist. You know, I think this and that, and you get into the whole thing. And they say, you don't even know what racism means. So they immediately make you feel stupid, right? That's what racism used to mean, but we have a much more sophisticated, updated definition now, and you don't even know what it is. So how are you going to say you're not racist if you don't even know what the definition of racism is? This is a much more complicated thing. You don't even understand systemic racism and the systemic nature and structural nature. They're bombarding you with this, and they're making you feel inferior and dumb. And then how are you going to resolve that? Well, you're going to go find out what the definition means, and you have to properly engage with it, which means engage with it the way they tell you to. And if you don't, then you haven't engaged with it properly. That's all through their literature. So it's this weird bullying thing.
I was trying to read the whole thing in the coffee area of the bookstore. And then finally I said, okay, I just got to buy it, give her the money and take it home. But, you know, she coined this term in 2011 and it's been around. The concept's been around for a while. And like I suspected, I haven't read anything in the book so far that's surprising. She's just recycling the same talking points that they have. But, the ideology is a system of belief. It's a way of looking at the world. It's if you're a Christian, your system of belief, you look at the world in a particular way. That you could also maybe call that your ideology. But she's opposed to individualism, which tells you a little bit about what her ideology is. Social justice ideology is a collectivist ideology, just like white supremacy. It says that the best way to look at the world is to judge people and treat them differently based on what groups they're in. Now, like Marxism used to say, the best way to look at the world is as a struggle for wealth between class groups. And that's how you looked at everything. This is a mutated kind of Marxism that says the best way to look at the world is as a struggle for power between identity groups. And so everything they do is they look at everything through this lens, and you're not judged as an individual or treated as an individual. You're judged and treated as a member of what, identity groups you're in, which of those they decide are privileged or oppressor, and which of those they decide are marginalized or oppressed. And then they have some calculation they can never explain to come up with your unique power figure, like your unique number of. They can't really explain that part.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting about the book is that she actually says that this is a book written for white progressives.
Yes.
And I actually thought that was very telling. It's not written to convince people that aren't already like almost there. It's people that are like on the edge of the collectivist thing and maybe agree with components of it. And it's designed, I think, to kind of push them right over the edge.
Yes. And it's funny you mentioned that part, because the sentence, like right after that, I underlined or I highlighted, because I was like, wow, I agree with her on this sentence. She wrote, I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. Wow. Yes. Now, I would nitpick at that a little bit and say, I don't actually believe that social justice warriors or people who subscribe to social justice ideology are progressive. A lot of them think they are. They call themselves progressives. I thought I was a progressive. I thought I was liberal and progressive. But it's not, I don't think it is a progressive kind of politics. I think it's regressive. So I guess I would change that to say, I believe that white social justice warriors cause the most daily damage to people of color. But I agree with what she's trying to say. Isn't that crazy? I'm like, yeah, I think you do. I think this book causes a lot of problems for people of color, because it is so, it's a duplicitous ideology. It tells you it's about one thing, but it's really about something else. And so you can almost do, I don't know if we'll ever talk to enough people about the complexities of it, because there's so many ways in which it contradicts itself. There's so many ways, it's continually mutating. There's always new things you can't say, or that you must say. It's very concerned with controlling language. It controls people by controlling language. Mm-hmm. It controls thought by controlling language. And so that's why you see them come up with these terms. They coin these terms like white fragility, which itself, I think we've talked about this before, but it's a Kafka trap. It's like, the Salem witch trials. You either confess, in which case you're a witch, or in this case you have white fragility, and then after you confess, by the way, you need to start pointing out other witches. Yeah. You start like calling other white people up for the white fragility. If you deny it, any form of trying to argue with it, or to say where's your supporting evidence for this concept, is deemed evidence of your white fragility. That's a circular. There's no way. That's why we call it a Kafka trap, because if you say, well, X, Y, and Z, this is a reason why I do not agree with you, they'll say, aha, you're disagreeing. Evidence.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. And the whole book is like, it is an insane book. As you said, this is all coming from somewhere. Right? She didn't create a lot of this. She's just reiterating it and framing it in different ways. Am I right about that?
Yes, they recycle each other's talking points. They repeat a lot of the same stuff, but they also build on previous concepts that they just put forward as facts. So Peggy McIntosh was a white woman, a very wealthy white woman, who in 1987 is credited, some people argue it wasn't her, but she's credited with coining the term white privilege. She wrote a much shorter read than this book. It's called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, where she goes through, and it's basically a personal essay. It's like personal observations. There's no sources. There's nothing in there that's scientific, but it's like, this is white privilege. That has become canon in this belief system. And so a person like Robin Diangelo, when she comes along in 2011 and starts talking about white fragility, then she can build on, you accept white privilege as a fact, and then you just move from there. And so they just continually build on, toxic whiteness. They build on, they're always coining, new terms, which are meant to, I think for the most part, most of their phrases and terms operate to discourage disagreement or debate or discussion. They're there to prevent actual dialogue. And like I said, a lot of this ideology is contradictory. They use a lot of newspeak. It's like Orwellian language where they say something that means something else. So they will say anti-racist being distinct from not being racist. And they'll tell you this, anti-racist is different from being not racist. Well, how is it different? What they mean by anti-racist is racism. They mean we want you to treat people differently on the basis of race. We want you to look at people and judge them on the basis of race. That's what they mean by anti-racism. And just like Antifa, anti-fascism, right. They behave in fascist ways, but hey, they put an anti in front of it. And it's really kind of clever at branding. I mean, you've seen this in the knitting world. They use the term radical kindness. The social justice people.
Oh my God, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
What does radical kindness mean? It doesn't mean kindness.
No, it does not mean kindness. It means kindness to people who disagree with me and shunning and mobbing for everyone else.
Kindness to people who agree, yes, and shunning and mobbing.
Agree, yeah.
It's like we are going to bully you and harass you and try and financially and emotionally harm you because we're being radically kind.
Exactly. Well, and you know what I find so bizarre about the whole thing is I've actually had conversations with people I know that are on the left that have no idea what I'm doing anymore at all. And they said to me when all the Antifa stuff was starting, they said, Carlin, Antifa are but a peaceful folk that just oppose fascism. That's almost a direct quote. I'm dramatizing it a little bit, but that is actually almost a direct quote. They're just against fascism. I don't know why you would be against Antifa. And I was like, it's like they can't even if evidence is right in front of them, like some of these videos coming out of Portland right now where these people are trying to light the courthouse on fire, barricading federal agents in this courthouse and trying to light it on fire. You put this evidence in front of them, they're like, that's not Antifa. Those are white supremacists.
In disguise, right?
In disguise. Secret white supremacists.
Well, I'll be honest, I do think that social justice, people who push social justice ideology, which include Antifa is like the violent arm of this belief system. They do push white supremacy. They're very similar to white supremacists. They believe, just like white supremacists do, that your racial identity is in your sex and all these things. Those are the most important things about you. That you must view the world through a racial lens, and you must treat people differently because of that lens. And then they even believe they've started pushing these things. I'm sure you saw. The Smithsonian Museum, one of their museums had put out a whole checklist of whiteness. What is whiteness? What is white culture? And it included things like showing up on time, meritocracy, hard work, the nuclear family. And it's so insulting. It's logic, objectivity, reason. To say that those things are part of whiteness and that white people own those things is something that a white supremacist would probably agree with. Like they overlap in really strange ways. And you almost step back from it and look and say, can't they see how horribly offensive this is and racist to everyone, because they're necessarily looking at the world through a racist lens, but especially racist towards anyone who's not white. Like how condescending and is that? What are you trying to put in children's heads?
So I'm curious to know if you have done much work with educators and if you see any applications for your work specifically in K-12 school settings.
Absolutely. I am a former professor of education. So I've worked many years in large teacher training programs. To be really blunt, I think our education system is the belly of the beast, along with Hollywood, basically. Hollywood pumps out the stories, the images, the representations, and schools reproduce inequality by basically being sorting mechanisms, and our schools sort children into unequal places in society. I think everyone knows that. I think teachers are critical, and I think regardless of intentions, when you have an overwhelmingly white teaching force, right? We have a very racially homogeneous teaching force. You inevitably have the reproduction and the dissemination of racism and white supremacy just by virtue of the homogeneity, right? Most of those white teachers grew up in mostly white neighborhoods, went to mostly white schools, rarely, if ever, had a teacher themselves who wasn't white. And that's just the teachers. We haven't talked about the curriculum, the testing, the tracking, the funding, right? Schools are just incredibly efficient at reproducing racial inequality.
Why is it so hard for white people to see racism in themselves and other good white people?
You know, it's not one single thread. That's the way I think about it. It's a series of threads that come together to create a kind of irrational stew just below the surface, right? It doesn't take much for that to erupt. So probably a really foundational one is what I think of as the good-bad binary. We're taught to think about a racist as an individual who consciously does not like somebody based on race and intentionally seeks to be mean to them. Individual, conscious malintent. If that's my definition of a racist and what it takes to be racist, and you say, you know, intended or not, what you just said was racially problematic, what I'm going to hear is that you're saying I'm intentionally mean, you know, and intended to cause harm. And now I'm going to need to defend my moral character. And when you change the question, you change the possible responses or solutions, right? So that changes the question from, is this or isn't this racist, which is what dominant culture always asks. Was he or wasn't he a racist? You know, and then, you know, debate ensues. It changes the question from if to how. And it's incredibly liberating to change the question, because now I can just stop defending and denying and deflecting and explaining away and just get to work trying to figure out, okay, well, how was I shaped by this system? I was. How was I? How can I use all the things that I see as unique and special about me and apply them to figuring out how I got set up and then what I might do to interrupt that? And that leads to another key reason it's so hard to talk to white people, and that is the precious ideology of individualism. It's really precious. And we are reinforced in this idea that we're each unique and different. And yes, we are individuals. We are also members of a social group. You know, I often tell white people, you're going to be fine. Suspend your uniqueness for just a minute.
Out of your house, into the street! 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 Out of your house, into the street!
You'll be fine. It's well protected out there in daily life.
Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! I hear you! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up!
You really cannot grow up or spend any significant time in this culture and not internalize an understanding that it's better to be white. The research shows that children by 3 to 4, all children understand it's better to be white. There's a sense of entitlement to what we have, right? The ideology of meritocracy that says, you know, whatever I have is purely from my efforts, right?
So in a nutshell, what is white fragility?
Well, when I coined that term, the fragility part was meant to capture how little it takes to upset white people racially. For a lot of white people, the mere suggestion that being white has meaning will cause great umbrage. Generalizing about white people. Right now, me saying white people, and as if I could know anything about somebody just because they're white, this is how we maintain control racially, is through this white fragility. It causes people of color to have to walk on eggshells lest we lash out at them. And it's deeper than just defensiveness. Keep that in mind. It's defensiveness that functions to maintain the racist status quo and the white position within it. And that doesn't have to be conscious. So for those listeners who are involved often in cross-racial discussions, if you pay attention, you'll notice patterns. And those patterns are that white people tend to speak first, speak most, do the intellectual work, and then people of color do the emotional work, right? And so if I'm noticing that, right, I'm noticing that people of color are really taking risks and being vulnerable and showing themselves, and white people are going into their, philosophical and society and, those distancing moves we make. This might be a good time for me to step in and meet the people of color halfway, take a similar risk, right? But if I'm noticing that 5 white people in a row have just made comments and I just know what I have to say is so brilliant, well, maybe I should just hold back and make some space, right? I'm not going to get that call right by everybody. There's just no way. But that's what I should be paying attention to and thinking about. What's going on in the room? And so just to choose silence definitely is not strategic or intentional. I've had many, many people of color say to me, we don't expect you to be free of your conditioning. And we're not looking for that. We need you in the struggle, right?
I'm not doing it. 10-4 on gas! We're gonna gas! Yeah! Buckle with gas. Get ready to kick that shit. If you can, boot it back there. They all have gas masks on. Get ready. Gas masks on. Go back. Hey. Hey.
What we're looking for is, in those moments when that conditioning surfaces, right, where can we go with you? And if we can't go there, right, if we can't repair that, we're not going to trust you, right? And of course, when it surfaces, insisting on good intentions will not show that, that they can go somewhere with us. And that's when they may give up, or the wall may go up, or they may stay in with us, but it's not going to be an authentic relationship. I mean, as soon as you say the word paralysis, yeah, we're talking white fragility, right? I mean, how does it function? I mean, that keeps coming back to, if it functions to protect, your position, to protect your blind spots, to protect your worldview, to protect your comfort, then it's functioning to protect racism. So yes, it's white fragility. We're kind of arrogant on this topic. Foundationally have to change our idea of what it means to be racist. So what I say to the white folks in my sessions who, if we're going to be honest, aren't going to do anything different after that session, they're going to, oh, that was really interesting, and carry on. And say, I mean, that's part of being white. You can do that. Most of you will choose that. But I'd like you to do something for me. If that's the choice you're going to make, I'd like you to go home, look at yourself in the mirror, right in the eyes, and say, I choose to collude with white supremacy. And then carry on, but let's do it with honesty.
What message would you really like the Teaching Tolerance audience to hear about white fragility and some of the next steps that they can take as educators who have this profound responsibility to educate all children, whoever may arrive in their classroom, even if that's not students who share their racial identity?
Yeah, one, I want to say thank you if that is their commitment and that is what they're doing, right? That's what we need to be doing. So sometimes I feel like I'm really intense, but that's because there's such a thick layer of denial I'm trying to push through. And so I do want to acknowledge that commitment and how essential it is. And the message would be, don't ever be complacent in the face of it, that it isn't you. Some of the most oblivious and harmful white people are on equity teams. I just need to say that.
A cry to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. But what does the Black Lives Matter organization actually stand for? To find out, look no further than their leaders: Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. Here's Cullors in a revealing 2015 interview.
We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
Visit the Black Lives Matter website and read the list of demands to get a sense of how deep a transformation they seek. Quote, we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another. We can't be certain, but it's hard to believe this radical agenda is what most signed up for when they made that hashtag Black Lives Matter social media post, or that every employee, customer, or shareholder at Nike endorses a disruption of the family. The group became a self-styled global network in 2014 and a fiscally sponsored project of a separate progressive nonprofit in 2016. This evolution has helped embolden an agenda vastly more ambitious than a national defunding of police. The goals of the Black Lives Matter organization go far beyond what most people think. They're hiding in plain sight, there for the world to see. If only we read beyond the slogans and the summaries of the movement they helped to create. It's a distinction with a profound difference. Their radical Marxist agenda is bent on supplanting the basic building blocks of society, the family, replacing it with the state, and destroying the economic system that has lifted more people from poverty than any other. Theirs is a blueprint for misery, not justice. It must be rejected.
When you look in the city of Chicago, there are 9 children who've died by black-on-black gun violence from June 20th all the way to today. The Black Lives Matter movement has said nothing.
If you want an all Black Lives Matter movement that talks about gun violence, then start that movement with that name. But that's not what Black Lives Matter is about. It's not an all-encompassing.
So do you think we've made any headway?
I think it's more important to make headway in our own house. By the time the system comes into play, the damage is done. You blame the system? Where was his father? It starts in the house. It starts in the home. And yeah, well, my father got locked up. Well, where was his father?
And of course, we can't forget about your group of trained Marxists running the entire movement.
We are trained Marxists.
Let's do a little history recap on Marxism and see exactly what it is, what it's about, and why Black Lives Matter is trying to push it. Karl Marx believed in abolition of property and inheritance. So you guys have heard of China, North Korea, and Cuba, right? It was on Karl Marx's ideas that all these countries became what they are today. On his ideas that Lenin and Stalin built the Soviet Union, and we all know how that went. All these movements calling themselves Marxists have murdered over 100 million people and have enslaved over 1 billion. Statistically, wherever Marxism goes, economies collapse, terror and famine follow. It's supposed to be about sharing what we have, but who determines need? It's not the people, the state does. The ruling elite does. In order for Marxism to exist, we have to get rid of religion, freedom, personal possessions, and democracy. Lenin and Stalin wanted absolute power, and Marxism gave them that. Is that really what you guys want? Black Lives Matter. Where is the money going? When you go to the BLM website and click donate, it's not going to the Black Lives Matter organization as a nonprofit. It's going to actblue.com. Their donations aren't even associated with their organization. And then if you go on ActBlue's website, you will see exactly where the money is going. They have successfully raised over $1 billion. And I'm reading this directly from their website. If you scroll down to federal contributions where $1 billion has been donated, number 1, Bernie 2020, $186 million. Number 2, Biden for president, $119 million. Number 3, Elizabeth Warren, $90 million. Number 4, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, $55 million. Number 5, Democratic Senatorial Campaign, $31 million. This list says nothing about the Black community. You lied, you manipulated, you used the real emotions of real people to profit yourselves. Black Lives Matter. You have destroyed more Black lives than you've helped. You've incited and encouraged dangerous protests all around the world, resulting in over 30 Black lives being lost in the past 3 months. You've destroyed Black businesses, Black neighborhoods, Black families, all in the name of racism that was never even a big threat to the Black community to begin with.
In a Black neighborhood, Black on Black crime is real, and most of them are dying from Black crimes. White people aren't doing anything to them. I'm Black 52, I'm not oppressed. Ain't nobody oppressing me. America is more free than it's ever been. That's right. And every Black person know that. Is there racism? Of course. But overall, you understand how far we come?
The biggest threat to the Black community today is not racism. It's scam artists and fraudulent organizations drumming up violence while these rich politicians sit in their $1 million homes in their gated communities, sipping their tea, pulling the strings of the impoverished while their money continues to roll in and the Black community continues to self-destruct. As far as I can tell, the entire Black Lives Matter movement has resulted in more Black deaths, increased crime in minority communities, and loss of livelihoods in places affected by riots and looting. Black Lives Matter doesn't really care about Black lives. They care about money, they care about power, they care about control. Wake up, do research, stop blindly reposting a hashtag in an effort to look woke. You really just look ignorant, uninformed, and disingenuous.
We need you in the struggle.
Biden was criticizing Mitt Romney's promise to loosen the new regulations on the big banks and Wall Street, but it was how Biden said it.
He's going to let the big banks once again write their own rules. Unchain Wall Street. They're going to put you all back in chains.
Romney quickly taking aim at that Biden moment and at the president's campaign.
Wild and reckless accusations that disgrace the office of the presidency. Another outrageous charge just came a few hours ago in Virginia, and the White House sinks a little bit lower.
There was no apology. In fact, the Obama campaign called Romney's speech last night unhinged.
We have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids. Wealthy kids, Black kids, Asian kids. No, I really mean it, but think how we think about it.
Poor kids are just as talented, Lou, as white kids. The distinction there is they're poor whites, and how do you think that plays there? A gaffe, something more than that, a window to his soul? What do you see?
It's definitely a gaffe, and Joe Biden has a long record of making gaffes, so I don't think this one will stand out on that long record, but it does add to the question of whether or not Joe Biden is attuned to the moment, whether or not his moment has passed, and whether or not he knows how to speak to the Democratic base in 2019 and 2020, which is a much more modern, much more woke, if you will, base where words like that and statements like that are sort of seen as relics of the past and not sensitive enough to the diversity of the country. And he may face some of those questions from specifically younger members of the Democratic base, more diverse members of the base. And even though he's leading in the polls, his lead has been very fragile in part because there's some agitation among those members about whether or not he's ready not only to take on Trump, which is a whole other question, but whether or not he's ready to speak to the issues that face the country in a way that relates to the modern times and not necessarily to his history in the Senate in the 70s and 80s and 90s.
And again, to make poor synonymous with minority is something that's in difficult territory.
Yes, it absolutely is. But he was also asked specifically about calling the president a white supremacist. And we've seen other candidates come out. Most recently, Elizabeth Warren, in that New York Times interview, she said yes, when talking about where they stand on who and what the president is and what he stands for.
A lot of the other candidates have come out and said, you know, he is a white supremacist. I think Elizabeth Warren tweeted it last night or this morning. So, you know, I don't know what he gains other than the fact that Biden sees himself as being a notch to the right of the left, woke, as Tolu called them, candidates, and wants to stay positioned in the center as a moderate. I mean, whether positioning yourself like this on the issue of white supremacy is appropriate or politically helpful, I don't know, but it seemed like a strange distinction for Biden to make.
And again, that combined with the white versus poor, and Susan, he also keeps on referring to Theresa May as Margaret Thatcher, caught himself in the process of it yesterday. Again, part of what has been what is seen as a successful trip to Iowa for the former vice president, but does this continue to raise certain questions about him?
Look, it's all very on brand for Joe Biden, and what you see is what you get. A gaffe-free candidacy was never an option. You know, I've talked to advisor supporters of Joe Biden who, you know, recognize that's part of what makes this such an uncertain moment for the former vice president.
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
Like, hey, Joe, are you all right?
Yes, and by the way, what you all know, but most people don't know, unlike the African-American community, with notable exceptions, the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community with incredibly different attitudes about different things. So it's a very diverse community.
Stop. Pause. You can't be president. What? Stop. Pause. Pause. Listen, we can't play any games here, folks. This is a really old man who can't talk. Like, this is not a joke.
If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the fact I want something for my community.
What did he just say?
But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
I think the vice president misrepresented what the vice president wanted to say.
And this is one of the problems that the Democratic Party's having right now with this Joe Biden guy. You guys got to be able to call it out. You can't let this slide because everybody else sees it, and Trump is going to eat him alive. He's going to eat that guy alive. The guy can barely remember what he's talking about while he's talking.
Could you imagine if I said just a small fraction of the mistakes he makes, which are unbelievable, every speech? I actually said the other night, I was watching him when he said about half the population wiped out with guns. I said, that's a horrible thing. That's the end of his evening. That's the end of his political career. And then after the debate, they're reviewing him. They said, Joe Biden had a great night last night.
How is this possible that an elected official can get away with saying this as if this is fact?
Well, you know, there is a radical element. I don't want to talk about a specific congressperson because of the Hatch Act, but, you know, there is a radical element that has been introduced into our legislative body that seems to be intent on pushing their ideology. And they have an accomplice in the media in doing so. And this is very detrimental to our country. You know, I think, you know, we should be having a conversation with the media, and they should be having a conversation themselves, asking themselves, why is it that the press is the only business that has been protected by our Constitution. And the reason is because they were supposed to disseminate objectively to the people of America real information upon which they could make decisions. They were not supposed to try to manipulate people. So, you know, there are the radical element that is taking advantage of the ideological bent of the media, and it's unfair to the people. But as Thomas Jefferson said, the people will come through. The people will be smart enough to figure this out. I hope that's true.
They said, no, she has to go.
What's something that you always carry with you?
Hot sauce.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Are you getting information right now?
Hot sauce.
Hot sauce in my bag, Swag?
Hot sauce.
Really?
Yes.
Now listen, I just want you to know, people are going to see this and say, okay, she's pandering to black people again.
Okay. Is it working?
Yeah.